fantasy romance is kind of like a spectrum, you know? And a lot of the times when I see certain people reviewing certain books in the fantasy romance genre, either they say that there is too much romance and they would have preferred it to be more of a subplot, or they say there was not enough romance and they wanted more from that. So I wanted to make a little bit of a guide and give you guys some recommendations on fantasy romance versus romantic fantasy and the happy place in the middle that I like to call romantasy. So if fantasy romance is your girly, stay tuned because she's my girly too and I have some things to share. So fantasy romance and romantic fantasy have the same sort of things going on in there, but they have a different ratio of fantasy to romance. From what I've seen, the main focus of fantasy romance is the characters, the development of the main couple, their tension, their get to know you bullshit, that kind of thing. It also tends to focus more on the development of friendships. So we kind of have a cast full of characters. There's a lot of found family in these types of situations. Fantasy romance books also tend to be a bit on the shorter side. Usually they're under about 500 pages. If a fantasy romance book is in a series, these books tend to follow a different couple for each book. There's oftentimes an overarching plot, but we do get a new perspective because of a new hero and heroine. There also tends to be a lot less intense world building that the reader can get bogged down in, because the world building and the magic system and things like that are really not necessary because the story itself is focused more on the characters and their relationships and their interactions with each other. So if you love a story that is set in a fantastical world where the romance is the main point, while also most of the time having an overarching plot, here are some of my recommendations. Number one is the Fae Guardian series by Lana P. This is a post-apocalyptic story in which these women from our time wake up 2,000 years later in a world where Fae now rule and humans are kind of like the bad guys. They're kind of like the bad guys. And these women obviously try to figure out what's going on, why they woke up 2,000 years later, and perhaps find their mates. You know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying? This series has shifters, vampires, elves. My next recommendation for fantasy romance is the Stay a Spell series by Juliet Cross, the first book being Wolf Gone Wild. This is a paranormal romance series, so it is set in our world, but we are following a group of sisters, the Savoy sisters, who are witches that live in New Orleans. This first book is following Evie Savoy, who is known as a cursebreaker, hexbreaker, I can never remember. One day when a werewolf shows up saying that he believes that he has been hexed to where he cannot shift, Evie makes the decision to help him. Each book in this series follows a different Savoy sister. It's delicious. You guys know I love this series. Another recommendation for fantasy romance is the Witchbound series by Opal Rain. This is the first book, Witch Slayer. In this, we are following our heroine, Amalia, who is a little witch living in her little cottage. When her cat brings home this injured flying lizard, she nurses it back to health and unknowingly forms a life debt. When she is dragged out of her cottage and burned at the stake, this dragon decides to save her and take her back to his horde. This is a dragon shifter romance and it verges on monster romance at the end, but it's not that big. It's literally like a couple pages in the whole book. So if monster romance is not your thing, I still think you should check this out. It's really, really good. And the last recommendation that I have for fantasy romance is the Otherworld series by Emma Hamm. The first book being Heart of the Fae. This series is pretty much like fairy tale retellings. The first two books in the series are a duology. It is a Beauty and the Beast retelling. In this, we are following our heroine Sorsha, and her world is pretty much being tortured by this plague. She decides to take it into her own hands to make a deal with the Fae in order to receive the cure for this, and she is sent on this quest to find this banished prince of the Fae. I have only read the first two books in the series, which is the duology following Sorsha and Eamon, but I really loved it, and I definitely think you should check it out. Now let's talk about romantic fantasy. Romantic fantasy still has that fantasy element and that romance element that we all know, we all love, but the priority is kind of shifted. In romantic fantasy, we still have the buildup of the main couple and their relationships with others. However, the overarching main focus of a romantic fantasy is on the plot, the politics, the world, the magic system. In a romantic fantasy, there is an overarching plot that our characters are generally more focused on than their relationships amongst each other. The development of their relationship is not necessarily the focus, and it falls more into the subplot category. Romantic fantasy books also tend to be on the longer side, so think like over 500 pages. Usually this is because there is a lot more focus on the world building and the magic system building and the plot and different things like that, which generally tend to take a little bit more time. These books also tend to be a little bit more violent and explore some darker themes. I'm not saying that fantasy romance does not do that, because they do. They do. I'm just saying that romantic fantasy generally tends to focus on these darker themes like war and death and torture and violence and things like that. They may also contain more trigger warnings than fantasy romance because of the darker themes that are being explored. So if this is something that interests you, here are some recommendations. My first would definitely have to be the War of Lost Hearts series by Carissa Broadbent. This is book 1, Daughter of No Worlds. In this, we are following Tisana, who at the beginning of this is a slave. Through some shenanigans, she is able to purchase her freedom, and she makes her way to these people known as the Orders, who are pretty much like magic wielders. She wants to join their ranks and learn as much as she can so that she can go back and help the slaves that she left behind. This does have an amazing romance in it, but there is a stronger focus on the overall plot and politics of the world, as well as the magic system and different things like that. It's a fantastic series. You should definitely check it out. My next recommendation would be the Crescent City series. I don't know why I grabbed book 2, but here we are. I grabbed book 2. The Crescent City series, the first one being House of Earth and Blood. This story has a lot of twists and turns. The first book is pretty much like a murder mystery whodunit type of situation. This is more focused on the politics and plotting of the world at large, but it's definitely more plot heavy than, let's say, the ACOTAR series. Another recommendation that I have for romantic fantasy is Sword Heart by T. Kingfisher. This is more of a cozy sort of fantasy romance. In this, we are following Hala, who is a housekeeper for her uncle. When her uncle dies, he pretty much leaves everything to Hala, and his family is not very happy about it. They try to get her to marry her cousin. She says she would rather die. She decides to fall on a sword, and when she takes the sword out of its scabbard, a man appears, says that he is the guardian of the sword, and that he is sworn to protect the sword's wielder. There's low stakes, but it is more focused on what is going on outside of Hala and Sarkis's relationship. It's a very, very good book, though. And the last recommendation that I have for romantic fantasy is the Broken Land series by T.A. White. In this world, most of the people that live inside of the villages never leave, and if they do, they have to be under the watchful eye of a pathfinder. Our heroine in the story's name is Shay. She is one of these pathfinders. They can find their way. They can find the path through the forest because the forest has dangerous shit and mists and stuff. When Shay is betrayed by someone in her village, she is captured by this horde of barbarian type people who are going across the land and taking over. So Shay must make a decision whether or not she is going to help the Triteri on their quest to take over the land or go back to the village that betrayed her. Very good series. I loved it. It was amazing. And finally, we have Romantasy, which I believe is like the happy marriage of the two. This is my personal favorite. Romantasy books tend to provide a mixture of traits from both romantic fantasy and fantasy romance. They tend to have heavier character work, focusing on the development of the main couple as well as the friendships within the group, but they also have an overarching plot that has the higher stakes and violence and dark themes of romantic fantasy, while not generally being as complex as romantic fantasy. Romantasy, in my opinion, brings about the fun and amazing stories and characters that are usually found in fantasy romance, while also adding in the high stakes and the will they won't theys and the stressful situations of romantic fantasy. They may also explore darker themes such as drug abuse and use, trauma, violence, war, etc. They could be longer books, they could be shorter books, who the hell knows, because they're a mix. So if that sounds like it's right up your alley like it does for me, here are my recommendations. The first one is the Four Horsemen series, Quartet, I don't know, by Laura Thalassa, the first one being Pestilence. In this world, humanity has been deemed unworthy, unfit, and the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse have been sent down to eradicate them. This first one follows our heroine Sarah, who, when Pestilence comes to her town, she shoots him off his horse, and she does not know that he cannot die, and he is pissed. It's great. It's fantastic. This does have a lot of darker themes, but it is super fun. We're following a different hero and heroine in each book with an overarching plot, but we are generally focused on the romantic development of the characters. There is a lot of death in this Quartet, and it is kind of brutal, but it's really good. For me, this is also where ACOTAR tends to fall. We have an overarching plot, we have high stakes. Some of the things that are explored in the series are a little bit darker. We have substance abuse, we have discussions of mental health, but we are also focused on the romantic development. This is a little bit more of a mix, in my opinion, than the Four Horsemen series. Some of the books are more romance heavy, some of them are more fantasy heavy, but I generally think that it falls into the romantasy category. My next recommendation recommendation for Romantasy would be the Black Dagger Brotherhood series by J.R. Ward. This first book is following our heroine Beth, who is a half vampire who is getting ready to go through her transition. Unbeknownst to her, her father asked the King of the Vampires to help her through this transition, and through that they fall in love, obviously. This series definitely explores darker things. There is drug abuse. Drug abuse is like commonplace in this series, as well as SA and different types of traumas. It gets pretty dark at times, but it's a really, really good series. There is also this overarching war that the vampires are having with the Lessening Society. Lessers are kind of like humans who have given up their soul in exchange for long life and different things like that. They're working for the bad guy. The vampires are fighting against them. That type of shtick. For this, I would also recommend the Zodiac Academy series by Caroline Peckham and Suzanne Valenti. This first book is a little juvenile, so if you can get past the first, like, half of this book, you should be fine. This is a bully romance following our heroines Tori and Darcy Vega. When they turn 18, they find out that they are lost fae princesses, and they must go and train at this place called Zodiac Academy. It's really good. There is an overarching plot. There is some politics that are involved. There's darker themes that are explored. Some of the romances don't really kick off until book 5, so there is romantic tension in here, but it doesn't get fulfilled for a very long time. But I feel like the plot to romance balance is really there for this series. It does feel a little bit juvenile and clunky at times, but I do feel like it's a good representation of plot to romance ratio in Romantasy. So there you go. If you're interested, I also do dedicated Zodiac Academy vlogs on my channel. The link is down below or in the cards or wherever I decide to put it. So those were some romantic fantasy, fantasy romance, and Romantasy recommendations. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope you have a fan-fucking-tastic day, gorgeous, and I will see you next time.